Thanks very much for coming to Locate. And so I'm really excited about this panel. We're going to talk about maps, and you're either here because you love maps or you're 4 days early for your cruise line. So I'm going to assume the former. And what I'm going to start with, so I spent my weekend planning Locate, but also reading this book. This isn't Oprah, but I can do a book plug. If you're into maps, buy this book. It's awesome. It's from Bill Kilday, who was a marketing manager of Keyhole, which got bought by Google, and then he was a product marketing manager for Google Maps. It's the early story of how Google Maps got started. And on this panel, we're going to talk about what's happened since 2004. And I want to start you with the story of a Picasa product manager who was out presenting his product to Larry and Sergey, and the poor guy's up there in front talking away. And meanwhile, Larry and Sergey are looking at this laptop in the back, and all of a sudden the meeting stops. The poor guy up there is forgotten. Everyone's huddling around this laptop. It was Keyhole. And after the meeting stops and they do it, it says the commotion died down, and without a hint of business strategy to back him up, Sergey simply said, "We should buy this company," and thus started Google Maps. And that was a foundational change for all of us. So we're going to bring up some people who've been in this business for a long time. We're going to talk about what maps were and where they're going forward. I got to pick the panelists for this, so I'm really psyched about it. So please welcome up Manik Gupta from Uber and Diane Eisnor from Waze. Manik and Diane. Hey.
Hello. How are you?
Good.
Hey.
Hey, Marc. How's it going?
Okay, this is Diane. That's Manik. So let me just start out. This was a quote. I don't know if it's a real quote or a made-up quote, but CNN said it, and it was from Lars Rasmussen, who was one of the person who invented Slippy Maps, the Ajax Maps. He quoted Larry and Sergey Brin's telling his team in the early days that we're going to have to spend billions of dollars on this map, and it's going to be worth it. Manik, you were a long time at Google Maps. When you kind of think about that statement in retrospect, why was it worth it, or was it worth it?
I mean, it was absolutely worth it.
That's the right answer here, by the way. Yeah.
That's like a trick question. No, I do feel it was totally worth it because, again, it's obviously come a long way, and Google Maps as a product is used by more than 1 billion users on a monthly basis. It's a map that's available. I mean, it's hard to imagine, 10 years, 15 years ago, that you could get out at any place in the world and open up your phone and then have the ability to go from point A to point B and get very good real-time driving directions with traffic included in it and so on. So I think it was a very big strategic move by Google, and it really created an industry out of it, right? So I personally think it was worth it.
Yeah. So Diane, you started, and I was telling Diane a story in, when did Google buy Waze? 2012? 2013. I don't remember. I'm sure the IRS does. In 2013, there was rumors that Google was going to buy Waze for $1 billion, and I was at a OpenStreetMap conference in front of 200 mapping people, and I said, there's this rumor Google's going to buy Waze for $1 billion. Show of hands. How many people think it's going to happen? How many people don't? 2/3 of the people in that room said it was not going to happen. Of course, it happened the next day. And was it worth it for Google? What was Waze? What was something that Waze did that Google needed?
So first of all, 2/3 of the management team thought it wasn't going to happen.
Of Waze.
Yeah, of Waze. What was in it for Google? I think Google has made such a commitment to this space, and not just the product space, but the ecosystem. And we were doing something that was very unique from Google Maps, what they were doing at the time. And it was really about the continuation of crowdsourcing, pushing the community further, all of the being able to use the citizens as probes and what you can do with that information. And I think, it's a testament to Google that we're still very autonomous within the company and still.
You've still been run as a separate group.
Yeah.
There, yeah.
Yep.
And Manik, your first job, I think, was with Ground Truth. And again, in this book, Ground Truth is held up. And to put that in context, we were talking backstage, when Ground Truth started, no one ever thought that anyone would ever build another digital map of the world. They thought 2 people had done it. It was such a big task, and that came on. What was the math or the thinking or the strategy behind that? Why did Google do Ground Truth?
Yeah, so
and explain what Ground Truth is.
No, absolutely. So I'll get into that. So my first job was actually not Ground Truth. My first job was I joined Google in India, and I was responsible for a product called Mapmaker.
Oh, right.
Which
Aw.
was, yeah.
Aw.
And I was also, by the way, on the other side of the Waze acquisition. So what Deanne said is right. No, so I was initially the product manager for Mapmaker, which was a tool that was conceptualized in India to really create maps for all these markets out there, which really didn't have any other option. It's really fortunate for us in many countries that you have governments and public bodies that have invested so much into geospatial technology so that there is a decent map that's available for people to use. But in many markets around the world, or many countries around the world, that's not the case. So Mapmaker came around because it was all about how can we create a tool set which will allow people to contribute the local knowledge about their neighborhoods into a way in which it can make it to the biggest sort of publishing platform, which is Google Maps, for that data. So that was my first job. I started managing Ground Truth in 2011 when I moved here to the US. So let me explain what Ground Truth is and what was the motivation behind it. So Ground Truth was a project that Google started in around 2007, 2008. And it was really a very strategic top-level initiative to create maps from scratch for the entire world, right? And there were from my perspective, there were two really important reasons why Google did it. The first one was, if you rewind back to 2007, 2008, as Marc said, there were very few data providers in the world at that point, namely Navteq, which became Here Maps later, and TeleAtlas. And these two companies had been doing this for years. And they obviously, from a financial standpoint, as Google was licensing this data, it was becoming prohibitively expensive, even for Google, to essentially license this data from them because of the rapid growth in what they were seeing with respect to the consumption of that data on mobile devices. So there was a financial kind of reason for Google to consider that. But I also...
Sorry, just to jump in. That might have been expensive. Building your own maps ain't cheap.
Yeah, so that's the point
Okay.
I'm coming to, right? So one of the things that Google does really well is they're a company, their entire strategy is focused on technical insights. So because Google had already started doing Street View, it became apparent to a bunch of really smart people at Google that, hey, we can actually use that to create maps at scale with the right quality at potentially a cheaper cost. And that was a technical sort of insight that drove that decision. So you combine that with the business need of like, hey, we got to secure our future with respect to such a strategic aspect of map data. That's the reason why Ground Truth was started. And I think the other thing I would say is it was also really hard, and it's again hard to imagine this 10 years ago, it was really hard for that map data to be updated frequently, right? So if you are taking data from another provider, typically you are kind of dependent on them for their update schedules. And that could take months in some cases. And if you think about Google's strategy, it's like they want to put the best product out there, and data is a big part of it. So the fact that they could manipulate their own data also allowed them to essentially go and make this big bet.
Yeah. So one of the things that I think we talked about that's interesting in the map world is this change to more and more real-time data, and Waze was at the forefront of that. So I have I have a history of maps presentation, and it starts with a Babylonian stone tablet in 600 BC and goes to MapQuest in 2004, and those are called the early years. There's some that glosses over some map-making milestones. And then I have 2004, which was Google Maps, and that was fundamentally interesting because, for a lot of reasons, but one, because I could now put my data on the map. And if you remember the mashups, that was exciting. The next milestone I have is 2007, which was the iPhone, and the map actually went with you. And then the last milestone I have in there was the acquisition of Waze. And why that was there was because it was one of the first markers where someone said, that data out there at the edges that we can bring back and create more data is fundamentally as important, maybe more important than the data that we're collecting statically. How would you critique my history of the map, Diane?
I think it's hilarious. I wouldn't critique it. I would maybe put some steps into the future. But on a relevant note, I would say that if Google's idea was the technical insight, ours was really about the human insight, and how could you get people to want to engage in sharing information from the edge. And back in the early days of Waze, people were driving around with literally a blank white screen, watching themselves create the roads using GPS traces. And it was kind of an obsession for a very small group of people. And then we started, once we had some base roads, then put these dots, and you became a little Pac-Man guy, and you would eat the dots, and that's how we verified the roads.
Yeah. It's very Pavlovian.
Exactly. And then cupcakes, what people would do for cupcakes, these virtual points that we would put in areas where we didn't have good information and get people to do that. So it was seeing that there was a mechanism by which you could get people very easily and in a fun way to want to share this data, that for us was kind of the big insight.
And what was your first role at Waze?
I started the U.S. office.
Because Waze had started in Israel, and done a pretty good job mapping Israel, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, it was very early, and I mean, at that point, the whole reason Waze was started was due to a cease and desist from the map incumbent, who didn't want us to update the map, even though there was a thriving community of people who wanted to update it. So that's why we started Waze. It was making some progress in Israel, and the hypothesis was, hey, there might be this problem elsewhere in the world, so I started the U.S. office.
That worked well.
Apparently there's traffic everywhere.
Yeah, it turns out. So one of the things that I think is interesting in the map world is, if you think back to when I got into maps, so the data that was collected typically had been collected a year before. It was integrated into the maps, put out. There was very little flow back, but the expectations for what consumers had of the map were kind of commensurate, right? It was like, okay, yeah, that street's wrong, but it was sort of commensurate, and traffic wasn't as great as it could be, but people kind of didn't expect that. One of the things I think that's really changed, and I'd love to hear from, because you're now dealing with this in a big way, is how has this ability to collect real-time information about the world changed consumer expectations? Because they're dramatically higher now than they ever were.
Well, I mean, from our perspective, the expectation is that we are 100% accurate at every second of the day about every bridge that is closed, every accident that's happened. And, it's funny because with the Waze brand and product, you either really love it, or maybe you don't know about it, or it's really not your thing. But for the people who love it, we get angry notes. Why wasn't this captured on the map? And you're relying on more data points than ever existed before with the number of drivers we have out there, and it's just not possible to be able to get everything. But that's what we keep working toward. And I would take it even one step further, which is now that our data is being used not just by the people who use the app, but by 650 cities around the world to kind of keep the cities running. The expectation from people is that the cities are going to take action and fix traffic, fix the pothole, fix the construction. And so I think that the pressure is mounting on all of us, that the expectation is action and solving of problems.
So do the cities like you or not like you?
They love us. Manik?
Yeah, they love them. No, so look, my perspective is, what Deanne said. I feel that we are at actually a very interesting point in the mapping evolution. I know your history kind of, you need to update your presentation for beyond 2013, if you will. I think you're absolutely right that the expectations that people have from a map are changing dramatically. If I look at Uber as an example, companies like Uber would not have been possible if we didn't have a very detailed sort of model of the world that was available for us to build a business on top of. We today perform or operate a real-time, real-world marketplace. And there are not that many marketplaces like that, right? Where you're making decisions in real time, but it's impacting something in the real world. And in order for us to do that, you really have to have access to the best-in-class mapping stack, if you will. And from an expectation standpoint, I know folks who live in San Francisco, for instance, if the ETA is less than 3 minutes, sometimes you're like, why? What's going on, right? And that's kind of how the bar has moved, right? And in order for us to do that, I mean, just again using Uber as an example, there is a bunch of data that is required to create that magical experience that has never really been mapped before. So that's what I like about maps as a domain, because just when you think it's kind of done, like there's that next layer or the next use case that comes along. So for instance, if you look at pickups, one of the biggest issues that we constantly focus on is how do we improve the pickup experience for riders and drivers. And there are no designated pickup spots in many cities around the world. So you want to make sure that you use a lot of the data that you already have about past pickups, and you're able to create an experience where you can guide both the rider and the driver to get so that they can ensure that the pickup happens in a smoother manner. So there is a lot of that kind of detail, the next level of detail, which might not even be prevalent in the physical world, which is where I feel maps are going to a large extent. And that, of course, gets amplified with self-driving as well. Yeah. So in summary, I think my perspective is the customer expectations are totally changing. They're also changing because there are many companies out there that are pushing the envelope in terms of what can be possible with baseline maps and how you can build more businesses on top of it.
Is that becoming, for both your businesses, is the competition more about that real-time update? Because it used to be, in the old days, it was like, this map's better than that map. If you don't believe me, I'll show you some street in Armpit, Alabama, and look, they got the stop sign wrong, and ooh. But now is the competitive landscape shifting to how much can you tell me about what's happening in the world right now? Whether it's POIs, whether it's traffic, whether it's roads. Is that sort of the new competitive battleground?
So I would say that the real-time aspect is very important, but to Manik's previous point, it's what are we building, what services, what functions are being built on top of the map. And so it's interesting, I don't really see much of what's happening in mapping as competitive landscape anymore. I think we all realize that we need great data, we have access to great data, and nobody has the comprehensive set. And it's an impossible task to create. But how interesting of businesses can you build on top, of services to people can you build on top? How many problems can you solve for people, like real problems? If in the early days of map, and even with putting data on maps, it was really about showing the problem for the first time. Oh, there's this boundary, there's this border, there's this missing object. Now it's really about, okay, no, don't show me the problem, solve them. And I think that's one thing Uber has done really well. That's what we're trying to focus on. So it's not as much competition, but who can solve the most problems best.
Diane, you'd made a comment when we were talking before that you said, as I wrote it down, the living map has jumped out of the boundaries of the map. It's become the operating system for cities. What does that mean? You remember saying that?
Of course, yeah. What do I mean by that? So I referenced earlier the work that Waze has been doing in cities, and it started in 2013-14 as a data exchange program where we were giving as much non-personally identifiable information as we could into cities and have that woven into their traffic operations centers. And over time, we worked with just hundreds of these cities and departments of transportation to figure out how can we use this data to reduce congestion, to improve emergency response times, and just wacky pieces of information have come out of that, which is, for example, 70% of crashes are reported in Waze before 911 in the US. That means that any emergency responders using our data are able to get to the scene of an incident about 4 minutes faster than they could otherwise. So operating system for cities is very vague and very broad. But if you look at a practical level, it's how do you experiment on top of this data to figure out how you can make the best decisions as a city using this and its mobility, but it also extends to housing and lots of other things.
I'll add something there as well. Like even from our perspective at Uber, right, there's a bunch of partnerships that we are doing with the cities right now. So for instance, just today, the team announced, we had pre-announced this, but it actually launched, where we now have the ability, there's a set of new safety features in the app, which always show you your location so that you can call 911 and give your location in case of an emergency. And in some cities, I believe it's 5 cities around the US, we have already integrated that information directly with the 911 center. So now, by the time you call 911, they already have all the information about your name, the license plate of the car you're in, and all the information that we have. As Uber, we pass it over. And these are just early partnerships of how do we sort of keep moving the discussion forward. There's another project that we have called Movement, where similar to what Diane was saying, we release a lot of data, because we also have a lot of data around how things are moving around in the real world, in cities especially, because that's urban core is kind of where a lot of our focus is. And we provide that data through a project called Movement, where we give it through various cities. We just released this in India as well. And again, the goal is to sort of partner so that we can improve the lives of all the residents who live in these cities, right, through various mechanisms. So that's definitely a work in progress.
How do you think about, because you're running all of product now at Uber, and how do you think about that? I mean, that's got to be one of the most dynamic markets, and how do you think about that in terms of staying ahead of the curve and where the market's going to go? I mean, you made an interesting, we had Nelly from Jump on in the keynote, recent acquisition. I mean,
she was amazing, by the way.
Yeah, Nelly is awesome.
She was great,
how do you think about, at Uber, whatever you can tell us, how do you think about like the future of product and where it's going? Because it can't be too predictable.
Yeah. So I think the way we are thinking about this is, look, Uber built its entire business and service based on getting people from point A to point B using cars, right? And if you look at the way Uber kind of rolled out its service, it started with the black car service, then went to UberX, went to Uber Pool, and then now we have something called Express Pool, right? Which is even cheaper than Pool, but it requires you to walk a little bit in the markets that we have launched. If you look at Uber Pool, for instance, wherever we have launched it, almost 20% of our trips happen on Uber Pool, right? So our goal has always been towards mobility, like getting people from point A to point B, and also at the same time reducing the costs that are associated with it. So that's been like a relentless pursuit. As part of that, one of the things that we have started now doing with, we have a new CEO on board, and Dara, who's extremely, who's painted a very, very powerful vision for us, which is, if you ever want to go from point A to point B, you should open the Uber app, and we'll give you the best way to get there. And it may not be cars. It would be bikes. It could be transit. It could even be hourly rentals. And these are all the things that we have already announced. So there is this aspect of, can Uber become a transportation platform? And that is not straightforward, right? Because there's a ton of stuff that needs to happen to meet the customer expectations of quality and affordability. And that's the vision that we are executing towards.
And that would indicate a lot more partnerships, it would sound like, because you're not going to do all of those.
A lot more partnerships. It will require, I mean, if you look at the self-driving world, which we can also talk about a few years out, it will also require us to figure out how that gets integrated into this platform vision. Because if you want to, the fundamental need, going back to what Dan was saying earlier, the user need is going from point A to point B. And the question is, how can you allow a safe, affordable ride with a different mode of transport for that user? So that's kind of what, from a product perspective and overall Uber, that's what we are focused on. And it's a super long journey, which is going to teach us a lot as we go along the way.
Yeah. So one of the things just at the end to talk about is, I personally think that right now in mapping is the most exciting time in mapping that I've seen in a long time. I wasn't there in the Babylonian stone tablets. That was probably psych. But I mean, there's so much stuff going on. And one of the things I think for any of our companies to think about is, what is it going to take to be good at this in the next 10 years that might have been different than what it was in the last 10 years? Because this market has completely revolutionized. What do you think?
A few things. It's going to be essential that we figure out how to incorporate machine learning in interesting ways to gather all this information. I mean, I don't know if any of you guys, a lot of you probably have read Borges on exactitude in science, and it was this kind of.
We're not going to ask for a show of hands.
It's a conceptual idea that science could be so accurate that if you wanted to make a map, it would need to cover the entire world, inch by inch. And you push that to today, and the map is so much bigger than the real world and has so many more dimensions. And that's going to continue. And again, if you want to be able to use this map data to solve problems, you need to be able to experiment more quickly than ever before on what policies are going to reduce traffic, what's going to increase safety. So you're going to need to rely on AI. With that, though, comes a whole series of challenges and dangers. So I think one of the things that's really important to us is that we really look at how to be kind of wise stewards of how we roll out this technology in a way that is going to be truly helpful, but also transparent, also fair. So I think that that's going to be an important skill, both the ethical side and the technical side of AI. And then definitely autonomy and transport choice. One of your earlier speakers mentioned that we'll have another 2.5 billion people living in cities, and that will happen. So if we think traffic is bad now, forget about it.
Yeah.
And with self-driving cars, it's not just the technology, it's the policy side. And government is too far behind on this. We have to really help with the policy side, because if we have a bunch of wealthy people sitting alone in their self-driving cars while they're getting their nails done, that's just going to make everything worse for everyone. So how are we going to use these in a way that doesn't look at the individual point A to point B experience, which we're both focused on now, and looks at the whole grid experience and really looking at optimization?
Because mapping, to a certain extent, has been fairly functional. It's like point A to point B. But I mean, that's an interesting expanded vision of it, which is as point A to point B and how you move people starts to affect the broader ecosystem, the implications of that are you need to kind of take responsibility, or at least some ownership for that.
Absolutely. I mean, Dan put this really well. From my perspective, the way I break down maps is there is a base data set that is increasingly becoming pretty prevalent across different providers, and I think you can get to a decent base data set in many markets around the world. But I think what has changed, what at least I have seen change dramatically, is the concept of location, right? So in order for you to get accurate location, especially with mobile phones, it has come to a point where location is kind of powering every experience at this point, whether you like it or not. Like, that's just the nature of the game, right? So the fact that you as a user can open your cell phone and interact with any app, and you get access to the location, and they're able to customize an experience for you, that ability to curate that location appropriately and be good stewards of that location, by the way, because it's such highly personal data, is super important. And I think that's where the next set of experiences will continue to get built. The other thing I would say is, sometimes, like we've always talked about maps as mapping the physical world, right, and understanding what we can see, but there are a lot of things we can't see. Right? And there are all these virtual spaces. If you look at how we are making the transition to AR and VR, and also if you look at what a self-driving car sees when it's actually doing the mapping for itself, there are a bunch of things that they pick up which typically are not even visible to the human eye. So there is that next dimension, that next detail of maps. Once you have that data, how do you store it? How do you provision it? How do you build experiences on top of it to really help the end user problem? Whether it's point A to point B, or living in cities, or urban mobility, or whatever, what have you. These are all fundamental problems that will continue to be there. And I think the question is, how do maps allow us to just create
to navigate it.
Yeah, exactly. There you go. Perfect. That was a good one.
So let me just, we've got a few more minutes, but one of the things that's interesting in the market is the market sort of ebbed and flowed, the mapping market. And I'm not even sure if mapping, I'm not 100% sure I'm comfortable with calling it the mapping market. I think there's so much other things in there. But it's been one of those things where the market has at times brought more people into it, it's expanded, and at times it's consolidated. It's been sort of rolled up by a few people because the resources required to make it were so big. If you look forward, where do you see that going? Is this going to be a place where a lot of people play, or is it going to be such a big effort that only a few?
Yeah, I can take a crack at that. So I feel that even creating the even creating the base map data set, it's not something that you can do trivially, right? It's getting easier, don't get me wrong, but it's not trivial. So I do feel that there'll always be providers out there who will have a business with respect to creating these and then selling them for all different use cases that are possible, whether they're commercial use cases, consumer use cases. But I'm also actually pretty enthused by what I see with OpenStreetMaps right now, right? It's making, significant inroads. It's making significant inroads into what can be a good enough data set in many cases, but in some cases, a fantastic data set, right? We've always talked about, is OSM a navigable map? Can you actually build a navigable solution on top of it? I think there's a bunch of stuff that the community is doing right now, and a lot of folks, I'm sure in this room, are also looking at that very, very effectively. And I think that's actually a very good development, right? So if you have OpenStreetMap, and it continues to get better, that will provide a decent data set for many places. And there'll always be, I feel, there'll always be commercial providers who will figure out a way to ensure that they can provide that next quality of service. If you look at the major providers right now, a lot of them are thinking about going into self-driving maps, which, like I said, are completely different.
You almost need a different word.
Exactly, right? So that's the evolution, and as long as the right sort of aspects can be put in place with the processes and the ability to serve this real time, and detect change. I think one of the big things that is super important is, which I feel that why Waze especially, and Google also was very successful in creating their own maps, was because they had a mobile surface on which either users or probe data can come back to them, as opposed to other providers who don't have a mobile surface. So that closed loop,
of data
right?
back.
That allows us to. So I think that will continue to go, and some providers will benefit, some providers won't. But I think it's still an open market.
And I would just add that, I think how many people I see here on the developer side is a testament to the fact that it's a hot time again right now. And by hot, what I think I'm seeing is another level of innovation. It's like back when all of us were doing Ware 2.0, we all needed to come together because there was so much innovation, and we needed to share that information back and forth. And then we all went off and did our own things. And then people came together with an overlay around mobility when it was all about mobile. And now coming back together around a lot of these topics that I see here, but also the one thing I haven't seen yet that I think also mapping will grow to include is infrastructure. And I know that Eric talked about sensors, but it's also, what does autonomous infrastructure look like? What does adaptive infrastructure look like? How are we going to be able to move things around in our cities and our infrastructure so that that location information combined with what's really happening in cities and patterns will make sure that we can use our resources effectively as they get compressed.
We're out of time, but thank you very much. As I said, I think it's a really interesting time. It's one of the things I've loved about this industry over time has been to be able to work with many of the same people for a long period of time. Sometimes we change business cards, some of us more than others, but it's fun to see and it's fun to evolve. Thank you, Manik and Diane, for coming up. Thank you all for coming to Locate, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thanks.